Hello, Gerard.
Hello, Rod.
Nice to see you. It's been a while.
It has indeed, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have just read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky.
Yeah, I listened to it on
Listen.
audiobook.
hmm
Hmm.
That's quite an undertaking. Holy moly. Holy moly.
It was over 30 hours, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Straight through. I mean, and it probably takes longer to read, right? If you're actually in a chair.
for sure.
Yeah. What was your overall impression of the book? Did you enjoy it or not enjoy it?
I mean, a book that length, I find it a bit of an undertaking. I try to get through it. I would like to read it again and take it far more slowly. I heard something like 10 pages a day is quite a good number. And you
hmm
can write notes and think what questions is he asking you. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely need to read it again. But
Yeah.
lots going on in the story, lots to entertain us as well as to make us think. So yeah,
hmm So, you-
I
so
enjoy,
you
I
think,
enjoyed it
so you would say that it made you think?
for sure. There's a lot of
Yeah.
philosophical questions in there.
Okay. So there was some. All right. So yeah, Dostoevsky, man, he's long been one of my favorites. I gotta say, you know.
Mm.
Um, I first read Crime and Punishment in high school by accident. I just found a copy of it laying around, and I liked the title of it. I had never even heard of Dostoevsky, and I picked it up and started reading it. And I was like 17 years old, and I
Wow.
was stunned. I mean, I couldn't believe
Mm.
somebody wrote that,
Wow.
without any background knowledge of Dostoevsky at all. And I couldn't believe that a book like that existed actually. And
Mm.
so yeah, the Karamazov. I was telling you before. I read it two times. This the second time, once in college. I was a literature major, and then once after college, I read it again about 27 years old, maybe.
Hmm.
And the second time, it made a much deeper impression on me actually. And
In what
but
way?
that was so long ago. I mean, like I would definitely need to read it again
Yeah.
to get it, to understand the nuances of it at this point. Um, well, I think for me, you know, I went through a period of time when I think I would have identified with Ivan Karamazov, where it's all about like learning and reading and
He's the rational
yeah,
brother,
yeah,
somewhat
the rational
atheist.
brother.
Yeah.
He's atheist, right? He's very intellectual.
Yeah.
Um, and then of course the Grand Inquisitor, which he wrote, is an over intellectualization that leads to pretty much like catastrophic consequences, right? Of just you can rationalize anything, right? And so I think in those days, but what the book did was I found myself, and again I was in my mid to late 20s. I found myself, I don't know if I identified with Alyosha, but I wanted to identify with Alyosha. Like I felt the desire, like that's the direction I actually should be going.
He's the hero of the book.
He's the hero, and
So
but he's a quiet hero, right? He's a humble hero. He's not really that active, right? He's kind of a naive fool in a sense, but I think he triumphs, right? Like even if the world is totally devoid of meaning, like Ivan says, your best response is still just to love, right? And
yeah,
so, um, and that kind of got through to me. I think even
yeah, and not non-judgmental
yes, and just love humanity and people.
people. Yeah, love it. Every individual. Yeah,
Yeah, and Alyosha had that capacity, right? I mean, he really genuinely loved people, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, even people that treated him badly and insulted him. I mean, he really had an authentic quality. I remember of being able to turn the other cheek, right? It not as an ideal, like I'm going to do this to show off or something, but he like genuinely had that capacity, and so that was cool. So I have some questions for you that you gave me.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics here.
Mm.
Alright. So what the Brothers Karamazov? What
Mm.
type of novel is it? How would you describe it?
Well, firstly, Einstein said it's the greatest piece of literature ever written. So high praise there. It is many things. It's a family drama, a love story. All the brothers have love interests. It's a murder mystery, courtroom drama, and it's a philosophical novel looking at morality, free will, the existence of God or not, and many other philosophical questions.
Yes. Yeah.
I should say that a lot of what I'm about to say comes from a professor of Russian literature at Boston University. His name is Yuri Corrigan.
Mhm.
I listened to some of his ideas on this, so they're his words, not mine. A lot of what I'm going to say.
All right.
I thought I'd
Well,
go to an expert on this.
well, the beautiful thing about art is that it's really we are free to respond any way we want, right?
Yes.
So, so hopefully we'll hear some of your personal feelings about it too and reflection. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, as I say, I think to get a really personal idea, you do need to go a little slower and write notes. I'm not a big note taker for literature. Are you? I think that's what.
I've gotten a little bit better at it, like
Mm.
marking things in books, but no, I don't. I don't
And
take
just
notes.
write down my thoughts on things. I don't do that. So
Mhm.
there we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm more of a generalist, like get the general idea,
Hmm.
you know, and if I get the general idea, I'm pretty satisfied. you know, maybe that makes me lazy or something, but
Yeah. Well, I think to read these works of literature, if you want to do it properly, it does take work and time and thought. Yeah.
sure, sure.
So.
So, what is the Horace? I'm sorry. What is the historical background to the novel?
So it was published in 1880, and it was a time of great cultural change in Russia due to modernizing forces coming from Western Europe. Industrialized capitalism began to disrupt agrarian life. So these new ideas were growing in popularity. The country's leading intellectuals were strong advocates of the Enlightenment. They wanted to bring Russia into the modern age. And this clashed with traditional ideas. It was a war of ideas, and at the time it seemed irresolvable. And so Dostoevsky writes in the midst of these culture wars. And while he does in the book generally push back against enlightenment, he wasn't interested in winning the culture war. He was interested in offering a way out of the conflict.
Well, do you get the sense that he had an opinion on on the culture war?
Well, just with how the brothers end up, the rationalist goes. I think he goes crazy, doesn't he? He has to go off somewhere to get well, and the sensualist Dmitri, he's sent off to Siberia to the mines. So it doesn't end well for those guys. Whereas Alosha, the story. Although apparently this book was supposed to be the first of three, and he died after writing it. So I
Mhm.
heard that bad things were about to occur to Alyosha as well. But certainly in this book, he comes down on the side of the traditionalist thinking and religion and faith, but he gives very strong arguments for the opposing views.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, Ivan gives excellent arguments for rationality and not believing atheism.
Mhm. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he was religious absolutely Dostoevsky. Did you hear about when he faced the firing squad?
Yeah.
That story?
Yeah.
So I think that was a deep religious experience. He thought he was going to die.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
a mock execution. Yeah, he thought he was going to. Yeah.
Yeah, that would change you. Standing there thinking you're about to get shot, and right when you think you're about to get killed, it was all just a big sham, right? Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that would be that would be a life that would be a pivotal moment in one's life, you would think, right?
Yeah. You're facing death. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's safe to say, I mean, Dostoevsky was a very complex character in his own right and a very complex writer. But I think it's safe to say he was writing from a Christian perspective, right? I mean, he
Yeah.
definitely was a Christian, and he definitely believed in traditional Russian society.
Yeah.
He was deeply skeptical of Western idealism, but on the other hand, he was somewhat sympathetic to it too. I don't think he wanted to go backwards in time or something. You know, I think he embraced some forms of technological change and that kind of thing. You know, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, what I think he saw in the West, and he was probably right, it was just nihilism, right? Just I mean, look where it is now. It's just these dead ends of identities everywhere, right? Like there's no cohesion, you know. So all right, so the historical background, he was, and also, oh, I learned this too. Did you know he had a son named Alyosha who died?
Age 3. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess he wrote this book in a deep state of pain, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
he was in grief, like unbelievable.
Yeah. This was his favorite son, and it took him very. He took it very hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so we've talked a little bit about Ivan Karamazov, the rationalist
Mm-hmm.
brother, right? So it's clear Dostoevsky didn't side with Ivan all at the end, right? I mean, even though he gave some great arguments. But why does Dostoevsky criticize rational modernistic thinking?
Yeah. So the intelligentsia at the time, they wanted to rebuild Russia using cutting edge European ideas. They thought that reason should reign supreme over all other forms of authority. And he thought this was very utopian, adolescent daydreams of students. He understood that humans were far more complicated than that. When he was 17, he wrote, "I want to understand the human being." He realized that humans had trauma in their life, and the wounds that people carry determine the behavior without them knowing it. And this is something the intelligentsia of the time did not understand. So no one really understood. I think Freud learned a lot from Dostoevsky. So he realized that there was a role of unconscious behavior, whereas the intellectuals believed the population could force themselves to be rational, do away with trauma, just become pure will. And he saw this as extremely shallow.
Mm-hmm.
He believed modernity means we are cut off from any traditional roots. We become isolated, fragmented, cut off from others and also ourselves. That we are under the illusion that we are walking minds that make all of our decisions for ourselves, when in fact there's a wholeness to being human. And of course, the three brothers show part of that wholeness in the rational, the spiritual, the sensual. So he really was going against the thinking at the time. Yeah, he thought it would be a disaster just to completely do away with all traditional and spiritual thinking and not understanding the individual and why we do things.
Mm-hmm. So the brothers, they all represent a different worldview. But what about the father? What 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 does the father represent?
Well, he didn't believe in religion, so he had no morality. He thought, well, I can do whatever I want in this world, and he didn't feel guilty for it either. Whereas someone like Dmitri also was a sensualist, but he did care about the morality, certainly towards the end of the book. So yeah, the father was possibly the worst father you can imagine, but he's quite entertaining.
Right. He's funny
Hmm.
and terrible. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's
terrible,
very
terrible
memorable.
human.
Because Dostoevsky, I remember this one time. I heard he said, "All of us are the father.
Mm.
Everybody
What
is."
did he mean by that?
Well, we're all kind of scoundrels in a sense, right? Like we're all immature. I mean, the father is particularly immature character, right? I mean, he's always joking around, and he's got no sense of care, right?
Mm.
Um, and Dostoevsky gave him his name. I mean, the father's name is Fyodor,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So, he identified with him on some level, right? Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I mean, most people don't behave like that, though, do they?
not to that extent. No, I mean, it's an exaggerated,
Mm.
sense, but just being, just being very self-seeking, right? Um, yeah, I think there is a case to be made that we all have elements of that in
Yeah,
us, right? I mean, but
yeah,
we all have. I guess we all have elements of everybody else that we ever meet in us in some capacity, right? But
yeah. I mean, it's part of the struggle, isn't it? That we might want to behave like that, but
exactly,
most
exactly,
people don't because it's not accepted in society, and you want to be a
right.
more moral person. Yeah.
Or you have a conscience, right? So which could,
Exactly. Yeah.
like Dimitri had a conscience. I mean, Dimitri was actually my favorite character because
Uh-huh.
I mean he's I mean, I just remember like that's a character in world literature who literally jumps off the page at you, right? I mean, it's just so
Mhm.
vivid, right? And but honest, there was something about him that garnered respect actually too, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you couldn't just disqualify this reckless, impulsive, womanizing alcoholic, right? I mean, there was something about him that you admired. I felt like, you
Well,
know,
he certainly went on a journey, as they all do in the book, all the brothers, transformative journey. And even though he wasn't guilty in the end of killing his father, he said, "Well, I'm guilty of so many other things." So,
yeah,
yeah, he definitely wanted to become a better person.
yeah. And wasn't his plan that they were after prison? He and his fiance they were going to run off to America, right, and start a new life. I mean, wasn't that kind of like his plan?
Grushenka,
Yeah, with
Grushenka, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, okay, well, good. So rational thinking being at best unlimited. Um, so tell me about the family. What was the family dynamic like?
Well, I'll just go through the sons in more detail. So yeah, Dmitri was the wild one, but as I said earlier, the complex are far more complex. He has a longing in his soul to be good as well. Um, Ivan was the extreme intellectual atheist, had studied abroad in Europe, coming back with these ideas, but he could also be extremely sensitive as well. And even though Alyosha was the good-hearted boy, he had many doubts about God. I don't know if you remember, he waited for a miracle when his elder died. He had a lot of doubt that night. So yeah, these are complex characters. Um, just looking at Alyosha, he goes through a transformation illustrating key philosophical ideas of Dostoevsky. And this is his ability that he can look at people and love them non-judgmentally, which we said before. and that is for Dostoevsky the hardest thing to do. So yeah, this novel is about active love. That is the term that is used to look at people, love them non-judgmentally, however they behave. So yeah, he's interested in, certainly with Alyosha, he has a moment of doubt, and he goes through the dark night of the soul to find something deeper when he's really looking for the faith. So Dostoevsky's interested in the moment of crisis when your foundations are torn away and you are forced to look inward.
Mm-hmm.
That's Alyosha.
Mm-hmm. Do you get the sense Dostoevsky was trying to lead the reader to take one view over the others?
Absolutely. He comes down on the side of Alyosha.
Yeah.
However, giving a great argument for the other side.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he certainly represents the other sides very well. Yeah.
Very well. And that they are going through a transformation.
In fact, this is just a little side note. I was listening to a talk on the Brothers Karamazov yesterday because I knew we were going to do this. Apparently, Dostoevsky was very worried after the publication that he had done too good of a job representing Ivan.
Sure.
And with the Grand Inquisitor, which we'll talk about in a second, but like he was worried that was going to be taken as like the right way forward. And this is interesting because Vladimir Putin, like Einstein and Freud and all these other writers who think that Brothers Karamazov was the best book ever written, so does Putin.
Mm.
Because of that, he's taking the side of the Grand Inquisitor. Like he actually thinks that that's what Dostoevsky was driving at, that we shouldn't have a free will, right? Now, whether or not there's really a free will or not, I mean, that's a whole other debate, right? But in general, the idea of the Grand Inquisitor is that Christ gave people a free will, and that's been our downfall ever since, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And Putin very much takes that view, right, as a leader in the world, and so it's like, oh God, like so Dostoevsky may have been right that some people did misinterpret because he was so convincing.
It's a great argument, yeah.
Yeah. All right, good. So, before we get to the Grand Inquisitor, which is the most famous thing in the book, right? But
yeah.
What about how does grief play a part in the novel? Grief.
Yeah, so this is something we mentioned, that his son died, his favorite son, and Dostoevsky had these questions. Why did children suffer? Why did his child die? Why did terrible tragedies happen? It's not just an intellectual preoccupation, but something he really thought about himself. So I think that the novel is born from grief. And I just looked up, I just put a question into the internet. What are the answers that Dostoevsky or other writers come to the question, why do children die? And just a few answers were that suffering can lead to spiritual growth. That's one idea. It's part of a divine plan that we are not aware of, and it's a test of faith. Again, he doesn't argue them too forcefully, but these are all possible ideas that he came up with. But yeah, very important to know that his son died, and he was grieving while asking these questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, that just adds a whole other layer of texture to it, right? That he was in deep pain writing that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Now let's talk a little bit about the Grand Inquisitor, right? Which is a
Yeah.
one whole chapter of the book, I think, or maybe even a whole book. I don't remember. But so so what was the Grand Inquisitor all about?
Yeah, so it's a poem by Ivan. Now, Ivan, to remind us, is the rational atheist intellectual. And the story goes something like this. Jesus comes back to Earth in the 16th century, and he meets the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, who imprisons him. And you think, why would he do that? This is Jesus. But the Inquisitor says that Jesus is working against the betterment of mankind. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses the three temptations of the devil, of Satan, which Jesus declined in the Bible. And he says that Jesus was making a mistake. The three temptations are comfort, superstition, and power. So just talk a little bit about each one. The first one, comfort. Satan says to Jesus when he's in the desert, you can turn stones into bread. And Jesus declines this. And the Inquisitor says that this was a mistake. It could have freed man from hunger rather than freedom of choice. So as you said earlier, Jesus gave free will, freedom of choice, but man would have been better off having freedom from hunger. And the accusation is that Christ freed only the strong. Man is not strong enough. Only a few of them are, so only the strong are freed. The second temptation is that Satan says that Jesus can jump off a high place and the devils will catch him. So this is a miracle. Again, he rejected it. And again, the Inquisitor says people need a miracle to be content in their faith. Again, we're not strong enough. We need to see miracles. And finally, the third temptation was that Satan offers dominion over all the lands that can be seen from a high place. Jesus refuses. And this was the power point. The Inquisitor says Christ's mistake was centuries of confusion, of free thought that brings war rather than security through power. So in the book, there's only a couple of characters that have this strength. And that's Alyosha and his elder, his teacher, Zosima. And the Inquisitor thinks that the majority of mankind is too weak to use their free will to find salvation. So a very strong argument against Jesus' decision to give free will to man, but it does end with Dostoevsky giving an argument again for this active love. So Christ listens to all of this, and what does he do? He kisses the Inquisitor. And this represents the triumph of love and faith over skepticism. The response is not a coherent, logical argument that rises above the limitations of language. It's a message that can only be expressed wordlessly, one of unconditional love and forgiveness. So I think these arguments about God and religion, it must be remembered that you cannot argue for God and religion through words. It should be expressed through active love, non-judgmental forgiveness love. That was the Grand Inquisitor.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, Putin, yeah. Miracles, he gave the miracle, like the oil. There was a lot of riches came in. That could be seen as the miracle. The power, of course, is where you don't have free elections, right? They want a strong leader. They don't want to choose. So that's where the power comes in. So yeah, you can certainly see where Putin might have learned something from this.
Yeah, the wrong things, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of people do want a strong figure, don't
Right. That is
they?
true. I mean, because that's the reason why the Grand Inquisitor is so compelling, because there actually is some truth in what he's saying, right? That
Free will's tough. Choice, yes, yeah,
right,
absolutely.
that security and freedom are not always compatible, right? In fact,
Right.
they hardly ever are.
Yeah, I mean, who
I
doesn't
mean,
want security? Yeah.
look at it. Well, like in America, I would say we've clearly chosen the side of freedom, right? Because we have a gun violence like you wouldn't believe. I mean, that is a problem we could solve easily. I mean, everybody knows deep down, just ban these goddamn rifles, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that we don't is saying we are willing as a society. I mean, I'm not saying I feel this way or not even a majority, but there is a core belief in this country shared by tens of millions that it's better to have that freedom than it is to have security, even if some people have to die for it, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a big question because, and that's hard, and to be honest, for me, it's actually hard to argue against that, right? Because it's like, well, because at what point does the encroachment actually start to stifle freedom? And I don't know what the answer to that that question is, but that is a really, really powerful debate. And I
Mhm.
think in countries like Russia, they have chosen the opposite, right? They've chosen security over freedom over and over again. I mean, first it was Lenin, then it was Stalin, right? I mean, no freedom whatsoever,
Yeah.
strong government, right? And it's so funny because I recently read another Russian book. I don't know. I love Russians, man. Like
Yeah.
the literature is the best in my.
Yeah.
There's no better. There's just no better in my opinion.
Mm.
But I was reading Tolstoy, who I
Mm.
also really love, and but this wasn't a novel. This was a book called "The Kingdom of God is Within You." It's a nonfiction book about his view of Christianity, and he takes up this issue very strongly that the church, just like Dostoevsky says in The Grand Inquisitor, that the church's role has been to correct the mistakes of Christ. That
Mm.
from right. I mean, come on. If Christ was God, he didn't make any mistakes, right? That's right. But from a societal point of view, that's what the Grand Inquisitor is saying, right? Christ made the wrong decisions.
Yeah.
So Tolstoy wrote a book just utterly chastising the church for being
Mhm.
the opposite of what Christ taught. I mean, Tolstoy is very much on the side of what Christ taught, okay, including complete and total freedom.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, to the point where there's no government. I mean, he was advocating. He was an extremist, actually. Like a true Christian wouldn't even participate in any form of government at all, right? That's how
Mm.
unnecessary it is
Wow.
if you are following, especially particularly the Sermon on the Mount is what he was actually talking about. If we following that particular teaching, you don't need any other guidance according to Tolstoy, right? So
Okay.
no, I'm not saying I agree with that or not, but I do think that there's a strong parallel there um, with what Dostoevsky is saying, because I think ultimately, even though the Grand Inquisitor is very forcefully argued, I don't think Dostoevsky actually took that view,
No,
right?
no,
I mean,
no.
he was more on the side of what Christ actually said rather than correcting it, or the church's role was to take the role of Satan. I mean, that's basically what the Grand Inquisitor said, right? Was the church's point is to be Satan in the world, and not in like an evil sense, right? But in
No,
a sense
no.
that's going to benefit the masses, right? We're going to benefit the people by giving them security and take away
Security. Yeah.
their freedom, which is what Satan was basically trying to tempt Christ into, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I just think that's very, very interesting that you have these two very deeply Christian writers, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, both very much on the same side of that argument of
Yeah.
what the teachings of Christ actually can do for a person if they're taken the right way, not in a religious. But Tolstoy is like anti-religion all the way, right? He's just personal study
Personal
with,
faith.
yeah,
Yes.
with Jesus's actual words, right? Like no priests, nobody in the middle. It's just you and the Gospels, and
Yeah.
and that's it. Unfiltered. Listen to what Christ said, and and he makes great points. He's saying like Christ spent every time you see Christ talking to somebody, he's talking to someone who's poor, who's uneducated, who's drunk, right? So if those people could understand his teaching, anybody can. So we've never needed, we we've never needed there to be any form of middle person, right? Because I mean, come on, the least educated people in his day were the ones that he was talking to, right? So, well, good, good.
Yeah.
Anything else that uh any
Yeah.
summarizing?
There's so much more, of course, in this book. You could talk for hours and hours, but I think we've touched on a few things that I certainly found interesting. And it's a book that should or could be read multiple times in your life, and you'll get different things from it. So I will read it in textual form, and
Yeah.
sure.
Me too. You've inspired me. That's something I should pick up again. I just, I don't know if right now is the time for for such a vast undertaking, but I know it's rewarding for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Good. Well, well, thanks for your insight.
My pleasure.
Yeah.